I've been thinking a lot lately about people who have been my spiritual teachers. And I've been remembering one of them, a man named Roy McKinney. Roy was a foreman for the Duluth-Mesabi and Iron Range Railroad. And I worked under his supervision one summer back when I was in college. Roy was a veteran of the DM and IR, just a few years from retirement. He had a ruddy, weather-beaten face and wiry, close-cropped hair, the color of rusted steel, I always thought. And he reminded me of a big, grinning jack-o'-lantern pumpkin. His had a crooked smile kind of carved permanently into his face. And I remember, too, that he had an enormous head, one of the largest noggins I've ever seen. His head was so huge, in fact, that the company couldn't find a hard helmet that was large enough to fit him. But safety regulations required everyone to wear a hard hat. So Roy just sort of jammed the thing on the top of his head where it rested at a jaunty angle, completely useless, his own defiantly preposterous fashion statement. I don't think I ever saw Roy without a wad of chewing tobacco in one cheek or the other. And I learned to give him wide berth when he was about to expectorate. Our job on the track gang was mainly to replace old worn-out ties with new ones, and then to realign the track after we'd spiked the new ties in place. And we accomplished this task with simple tools called lining bars, which are heavy steel rods about 5 feet long with a beveled edge and a point at one end. And we would line up in a row on one side of the track, perhaps a half a dozen of us, and we would jam the pointed ends of our lining bar into the gravel ballast beneath the ties and the rails. And then on a given signal, we would all together heave against the rail, budging it perhaps a fraction of an inch at a time. And meanwhile, Roy would be about 20 yards up the line, leaning down and peering along the rail with his practiced eye, switching his snuff from one cheek to the other as he squinted and signaled us to nudge it a little bit this way, now that. And mind you, this usually took place at the end of a long summer day working in the hot sun, and we were eager to have it over with. We were waiting for some signal from our boss. Finally, Roy would stand up, brush the dust off his overalls, eject a little stream of tobacco juice, and growl, "Good enough!" And believe me, if it was good enough for Roy, it was good enough for us. And ever since then, that phrase, "good enough," has become a kind of sacred mantra for me, a blessed reminder of my own essential humanity with all its limits. Some of you may remember Al Franken, former Minnesota Senator Al Franken, when he was a comedian on Saturday Night Live, where he developed the character of Stuart Smalley, featured in a skit called Daily Affirmations with Stuart Smalley, a parody of a short inspirational program which supposedly aired at 2:45 in the morning following a hair replacement infomercial. So you can imagine that not very many people were tuned in at that hour, but those who were watching were the ones who were meant to be watching. And Stuart took his job seriously. Before each taping, he sat in front of a mirror and recited the following affirmation to himself. "I'm going to do a terrific show today, and I'm going to help people. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me." And people did like Stuart, a lot. In fact, the skit spun off a successful book and a popular movie, so it was clear that there was something about Stuart that struck a chord in many people. Now, Franken's usual brand of humor could be extremely sharp and sarcastic, but he seemed to instinctively treat this character differently, honoring Stuart's fragile yet fierce vulnerability, his determination to assert his inherent worth and dignity against all assaults, and above all, his heroic struggle to accept himself with all his faults and flaws. Stuart embodied what I like to call a spirituality of imperfection, a conviction and a lived practice of humility, a recognition and acceptance of the truth that it is our finitude, our fallibility, our very limits that make us truly human. In his book, The Blessings of Imperfection, the late Unitarian Universalist theologian Peter Fleck recalls a story from his childhood in the Netherlands. It was a story of a gnome, he writes, who lived in the forest under the roots of a tree. He had one big wish. More than anything else in the world, he wanted to own a green hunter's bag. He used to think about his green hunter's bag by day and to dream about it by night. He had visualized it 1,000 times, and then one day, it may have been his birthday, he received a beautiful green hunter's bag as a gift. His dream had come true. His ardent wish had been fulfilled. He owned his green hunter's bag. Now, you would have expected him to be happy. But he said, "It's a nice hunter's bag, only it's not quite as green as I had imagined it." Fleck says that this story was his initiation into the understanding that only the idea of something is perfect. As Plato taught, the idea's realization, its expression in material worldly terms, is a mere shadow of that ideal perfection. The great philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote that from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing entirely straight was ever made. And one gets the sense from both Plato and from Kant that it's too bad that we couldn't somehow straighten out that gnarled and twisted human nature or release ourselves from the constraints of the material world. But as wise as these men may have been, I think there's a deeper wisdom that rests upon the acceptance of our essential imperfection. In the biblical myth of beginnings, God saw the creation and declared that it was very good, not because it was perfect in some coldly mathematical precision, but because it was good enough to provide a kind of cosmic holding environment for the human adventure. The biologist Lewis Thomas applies the logic of imperfection to all living things, to DNA itself. We humans, writes Thomas, are built to make mistakes, coded for error, as is the rest of creation. It's built into the very DNA that is the foundation of life. Evolution, growth, transformation, all are made possible because of imperfection. The British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott is known for having coined the expression, the good enough mother. Winnicott was reacting against the kind of Freudian orthodoxy that ended up blaming all psychological problems on inadequate mothering. That's nonsense, said Winnicott. The mother's basic job is simply to establish and maintain what he called a holding environment, a reliable, trustworthy physical and emotional space within which the infant can feel secure and safe enough to explore and grow on its own. The good enough mother, said Winnicott, starts off with an almost complete adaptation to her infant's every need. And as time proceeds, she gradually adapts less and less perfectly according to the infant's ability to deal with her failure. In other words, the mother weans the child of its need to be perfectly mirrored in every mood, and in so doing gives it the opportunity to grow. As one of my psychology professors said to me, if your parenting had been perfect, why would you grow? Some later therapists have referred to this process, whether it occurs in infancy or in the therapeutic consulting room, as one which provides conditions of optimal frustration, a phrase that I have come to appreciate over my years of ministry as well. We need just the right amount of frustration in order to be motivated to learn and to grow. Not so much as to be overwhelmed, but enough to provoke and stimulate our own resources and potential for growth. So to all you parents out there, relax. You don't have to be perfect. You can't be perfect, and even if you were, it wouldn't be healthy for you or your children. Winnicott's ideas have proven to be enormously influential and useful in therapeutic circles, and I sometimes wonder how they might translate to other contexts. I admit, for example, that it's a challenge for me to think of myself as a good enough minister, as someone for whom it is enough to provide a secure holding environment and then to trust the Spirit to move within that sacred space to enable growth in freedom. What would it mean to be a good enough fellowship, or to do a good enough job, or to get a good enough grade in school, or to abide within a marriage that was good enough? Somehow, it doesn't sound quite right, does it? We always want more. Something in us demands perfection. Hoca Nasruddin, the sacred fool of Turkish tradition, was once asked by his disciples, "How is it, Hoca, that in all these years you have never married?" "I almost married once," he said. "When I was much younger, I set about in search of the perfect woman. I traveled to Cairo, where I found a woman who was beautiful and intelligent, but she was unkind. So I traveled on to Baghdad, and there too I met a woman who was generous and gracious, but it turned out we had nothing in common. So I went to Damascus, and I found a woman who was beautiful and kind and generous, and we did have much in common, but her voice was rather unpleasant." And so it went on. This happened again and again until finally in Istanbul, I did meet a woman who was perfect in every respect. We had everything in common. She was beautiful, generous, gracious, intelligent, from a good family. The disciple interrupted, "Well, why did you not marry her, Hoca?" "Well," said Nasruddin, "it was sad. You see, it turned out that she was looking for the perfect husband." Nasruddin's foolishness reveals our own. In our quest for perfection, we may overlook or pass by in others and in ourselves that which is truly good enough. To be good enough is not to settle for less or to compromise our ideals. It's simply to recognize and accept the human condition of being finite and limited. It's a sign of spiritual maturity, I think, and its opposite is what we might call the disease of perfectionism. When I was a child, I remember being taken to a museum where I saw beautiful Native American beadwork, which I was told always contained an intentional error because it was said only the Great Spirit could create something perfect. We children always had fun trying to spot the error. Sometimes it seemed there was more than one. The Japanese have a wonderful, untranslatable word, wabi, which means something like a flawed detail that creates an elegant whole. A flawed detail that creates an elegant whole. I love that idea. Wabi stands for that aesthetic quality of an imperfect work of art whose very imperfection makes it perfect. The little dimple in the glazing of a ceramic pot, perhaps. The beautiful, distinctive aesthetic flaw that distinguishes the spirit of the moment in which that object was created from all other moments in eternity. Wabi. What a wonderful word. In the Sermon on the Mount, according to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus said to his disciples, "Be perfect." And that commandment has caused untold anxiety and guilt over the centuries. For one thing, it led to a kind of two-tiered development of spirituality in the Christian tradition, where ordinary folks just tried to do the best they could, while those who are truly religious are set apart and called to follow the so-called counsels of perfection. So they would live in a cloistered life where it was thought it was possible to achieve perfection, but not among ordinary everyday folks. That interpretation, though, rests upon a mistranslation. The Greek word teleos, used in the text here, does not mean flawless and ideal, but rather something like fulfilled, complete, whole. Live the human condition to its fullest extent, Jesus seems to be saying, and you will arrive at a kind of wholeness and completion that truly reflects the divine intent. Let God be perfect in God's way. You be perfect in the way that only you can be. Become who you are. In later Jewish tradition, we have the story of Rabbi Zusia, well-known story, who says, in the world to come, I won't be asked, why weren't you Moses? I will be asked, why weren't you Zusia? Our moments of deepest fulfillment have little to do with measuring up to some kind of abstract ideal perfection, and more to do with the recognition and even celebration of our finite human nature. William Harvey was a member of my congregation in Indianapolis, a brilliant young musician whose dazzling performances in church, he was a violinist, they were always met with amazed appreciation and much applause. How could someone so young produce such incredibly beautiful music? I remember when I first visited that congregation in the search process, meeting all the people in the week of what's called candidating week, and this 12-year-old kid came up to me and started asking me questions about the poetry of T.S. Eliot, and I was just, he was just a brilliant young mind and talent with his violin. And it certainly didn't hurt to have two musicians for parents, and as well as a talented older brother, and not to have television in the house, and to spend enormous amounts of time practicing. But William is also clearly gifted in some special way. He held himself to a very high standard, and at times he seemed to be quite hard on himself, a budding perfectionist. At any rate, in the fall of 2001, it felt as if the whole congregation was sending him off with a great deal of pride and joy to study at the Juilliard School of Music in New York City. A few weeks after his arrival, he sent an email to his parents. Now, his father happened to be an editor and music critic at the Indianapolis Star, so what began as a personal message to the family eventually found its way to the national news services. You may even have seen it in the media explosion which followed the events of 9/11. In his email, William tells of going downtown to the Armory, where he played with some other Juilliard students for the volunteer workers who were coming back exhausted from the World Trade Center site. After his friends left at 7 o'clock, he continued alone until almost midnight, playing for the soldiers of the 69th Infantry Division. So he wrote to his parents, the musicians. I played everything I could do from memory. Bach, B minor, partita, Tchaikovsky's violin concerto, Dvorak concerto, Paganini Caprices 1 and 17, Vivaldi Winter and Spring, theme from Schindler's List, Tchaikovsky's Melody, Meditation from Thais, Amazing Grace, My Country 'Tis of Thee, Turkey in the Straw. Never, he wrote, have I played for a more grateful audience. Somehow it didn't matter that by the end my intonation was shot and I had no bow control. I would have lost any competition I was playing in, but it didn't matter. The men would come up the stairs in full gear, remove their helmets, look at me, and smile. At Juilliard, wrote Will, kids are hypercritical of each other and very competitive. The teachers expect, and in most cases get, technical perfection. But this wasn't about that. The soldiers didn't care that I had so many memory slips I lost count. They didn't care that when I forgot how the second movement of the Tchaikovsky went, I had to come up with my own insipid improvisation until somehow, I still don't know how, I got to a cadence. I've never seen a more appreciative audience, Will concluded, and I've never understood so fully what it means to communicate music to other people. Human fulfillment, completion, comes not in being technically perfect, whatever that might mean, but in making the connection, the deeply human connection with others. I think the psychologist Carl Jung captured this wisdom when he said that at the deepest level, human beings desire not perfection, but completion. I would only add that completion requires connection. I believe it was G.K. Chesterton who said that anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Now there's a truly subversive statement in our society. Try reframing things in that way if you find yourself struggling with perfectionism. Now don't get me wrong, I have nothing against excellence. Quality matters. If the music had been truly awful, the soldiers' nerves would have been jangled rather than soothed. If the railroad tracks had not really been good enough, there might have been a tragic train wreck. Nor am I against idealism. Our ideals are necessary. Perhaps spiritual maturity consists in living in that creative tension between our ideals and our realities, living in that betweenness, that creative tension. Now, I confess that there's a little gnome inside of me who believes that if this sermon could go on, it might get better. Perhaps given enough time, it might even become perfect. But I'm going to stop here because I know that although this sermon is quite imperfect, I trust and I hope and I pray that it is good enough.